Okay, so good afternoon to everyone today, and welcome to our Women in Research Ireland event, Homelessness and Gender, a Constitutional Right to a Home. I'm Valesca Lima, and I'm co-director of Women in Research Ireland, WIRI. Today, I'm joined by WIRI members Kathy Corcoran, Mairead O'Connor, and Aidan Butler, who will be managing the Q&A and the chat. So our event today intends to promote a conversation about the relationship between gender, homelessness, and the right to housing. It is important to have that conversation because there is a misconception about women's homelessness as a minor social problem and as a subcategory of homelessness, because women's homelessness often remain invisible. In fact, women experience homelessness in high numbers. For example, in August 2022, at least 2,731 women they were experiencing homelessness in Ireland, according to official data. So in this current context of rapid increase in homeless figures and the possibility of a referendum to include housing in the Constitution, this event today will discuss the centrality of housing as a human right through gender lens. So to understand more about these issues, we are joined today by Dr. Sarah Sheridan, as an expert on issues related to housing, homelessness, and gender, and also by Dr. Ekaterina Yahyaoui from the University of Galway, a specialist in the fields of human rights and international law. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of their presentation, so you can type your questions into the chat box during the event. And for this recording, I ask you to keep your video off and your audio muted. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Sarah Sheridan, who is an independent researcher and expert on homelessness and gender. Sarah is currently a lecturer on the postgraduate diploma in social policy and practice and a visiting research fellow with the School of Social Work and Social Policy at Trinity College Dublin. Previously, Sarah worked in research management roles in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and with Focus Ireland. Sarah is also a board member of Threshold. She will have 10 to 15 minutes to address the audience. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Valesca. Just share my screen here. Is that okay for everyone?
Yes, that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much to Valesca and to Women in Research Ireland for inviting me to this event to talk about homelessness and gender, which is a topic certainly very close to my heart, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to specifically consider gender as it relates to the argument for a constitutional right to housing. I did a dry run of this yesterday just to make sure I was keeping in time, and I had a huge coughing fit, so I really hope this doesn't happen today, but I will be drinking some hot ginger lemon next to me, and hopefully it'll be okay. But anyway, so just to introduce myself and give a bit of context to what studies and evidence I'll be drawing from within this presentation. So my work in the area of homelessness and gender began in 2009 when I was hired on a Irish Research Council funded study which was an in-depth biographical study of women's homelessness, which was led by Dr. Paula Mayock and the School of Social Work and Social Policy in Trinity College. And over the course of 2 years, we interviewed 60 women experiencing homelessness in Dublin, Cork, and Galway. And we also carried out ethnographic observation across service sites. And this study led to publications such as these in 2012, and also to other publications focusing on specific cohorts or aspects of women's homelessness. And here's just a few, but if anyone would like me to send any more on, there's more articles and readings. I'm happy to share them with you. And then in 2011, I started a PhD under Dr. Mayock's supervision, whereby I built a longitudinal dimension to the previous study. And I tracked and re-interviewed the same women around 3 years after we first interviewed them. So in total, I was able to find and re-interview 40 of the original 60 women to see whether they were still homeless or whether they had exited homelessness, and analyze those kind of accommodation transitions during the intervening period. And after this, I worked for Focus Ireland as research coordinator. And as part of this role, I led research projects which sought to capture the underlying root causes of family homelessness in Ireland. And the findings of these quarterly reports are all available online through the Insights into Family Homelessness series. So for this webinar, I'm going to be drawing on a lot of these key learnings emerging from this evidence base and presenting a little around the scale of the problem, the issues in current definitions and measurements of homelessness among women, and consider women's pathways into homelessness, and also just touch on the stigma of homelessness and gender before pulling it together just to talk about the constitutional right to housing. I would like to insert, I suppose, a disclaimer, however, that I'm not a legal expert by any means, which is why I'm delighted to be co-presenting here with Ekaterina, who will be undoubtedly better suited to respond to any of those thorny legal questions. But yeah, just wanted to insert that caveat to my presentation. So first of all, the scale of the problem. So for context, I realize many here today will already be very familiar with this, so I won't delay too much on it, but just to present a little around the monthly data on homelessness and what it shows around gender. The Department of Housing publishes monthly data on homeless figures, which contain all men, women and children who are residing in emergency accommodation funded under Section 10 of the Housing Act. So while there's some notable exceptions to what is included in this data, and I'll return to this in a moment, this data does nonetheless give a pretty useful and timely indicator on the current demand on homeless emergency accommodation across the country during any given month. I've lifted this graph directly from the Focus Ireland website, which helpfully collates this monthly stats, and it's a very up-to-date and useful resource for those who aren't aware of it. But you can see in this graph that it details, this graph particularly looks at the adult homeless population divided by male and female. And the lower line indicates the number of adult women in homeless accommodation, and the upper shows men. And adult women account for around 34 to 36% of all adult homelessness in the country. But the increase since 2014 is more pronounced for women. So in April 14, there were 833 adult women, and in July 2022, there were 2,660. Valesca, you had the more up-to-date stat there on the August numbers. But this represents a 219% increase, and this compares to 190% increase in men. Granted, both are huge increases. And this increase in women is largely due to the unprecedented increase in family homelessness dependent on emergency accommodation, which disproportionately impacts lone mothers with their children. And this graph also shows the rate of increase in women's homelessness begins to slow down at the start of 2018 in a similar pattern to family homelessness, which we'll look at in the next slide. And this change in trend is less visible among men in homelessness, which continues to climb. In terms of family homelessness, 57% of all families in emergency accommodation are one-parent families. This compares to the general population of 24%. And more than 90% of these one-parent families in homeless accommodation are headed by women. So when we're talking about family homelessness, we are also talking about women's homelessness. And you can see here the purple represents the Dublin region, while the yellow represents the rest of Ireland. There was a peak in family homelessness in July 2018 when there was 1,778 families in emergency accommodation. And then there's a big dip due to the COVID-19 measures, such as the moratorium on evictions, the rent freeze that was introduced via emergency legislation. And the effectiveness of these measures in reducing the number of families presenting as homeless is one worth noting. And since these measures have been lifted, the numbers are on the march again, which is very concerning given that the recent budget offers no real protections to renters who are facing a hugely uncertain winter, and the number of landlords leaving the market is also increasing. But despite these unprecedented increases in homelessness overall, it's really important to also consider how women's homelessness are specifically underestimated in the figures that we see published every month. So international and national research tells us that women are less likely to sleep rough. So the rough sleeper counts carried out in Dublin twice a year usually capture between 20–23% women, and these would mostly be in couples. And secondly, women are more likely than men to live in hidden homelessness situations for a variety of reasons. They might be living in overcrowded or poor conditions or sofa surfing. And many women have reported avoiding homelessness services for a variety of reasons that the women we interviewed, including feelings of stigma or of fears for their safety. we would have found reports of women who were experiencing victimization in homeless services or in street spaces, particularly those with complex support needs. And several would have reported experiences of violence, of assault, and even of rape within these spaces. So this also resulted in a movement between homeless services and hidden homeless settings for prolonged periods of time. And thirdly, women's homelessness might be recorded as another issue, such as domestic violence or migrant homelessness, etc. So we can see these limitations in our own monthly data, including the fact that it does not include domestic violence service users, who are primarily women and children. The statistics do not include direct provision accommodation, and the data on both of these are either non-existent or very patchy. But I also wanted to include a point around the new migration flows of refugees coming from the Ukraine at the moment. So I noticed in the recent CSO publication in August, published August 2022, women aged 20 and over account for 47% of new arrivals compared to 17% of adult males, which is of course due to the fact that many men have remained in Ukraine to fight in the conflict that continues to rage. And related to this, CSO has shown that CSO data has shown that 38% are categorized as one-parent families. But given the soaring demand on temporary shelter and accommodation in Ireland at this time, and is set to worsen, the prevalence of women in these numbers is just certainly worth flagging when we're talking about women and homelessness. So broadly speaking, in many respects, statistical recordings of homelessness embodies cultural norms and perpetuates misconceptions of what homelessness is in all its forms, and therefore will ultimately yield gender-neutral policy responses. Moreover, salient dimensions of women's homelessness and their often gender-specific needs are more likely then to go unacknowledged. So really the way in which we define and measure homelessness has a profound impact on how we also respond to the issue. So just briefly to move on to the pathways or causes of women's homelessness from national and international research. And first thing to say is that the causes of women's homelessness are very complex and multi-layered, and typically have their roots in structural and socioeconomic disadvantage, which combined with, say, a trigger or a personal crisis, such as a landlord selling or a relationship breakdown or other personal crises, results in a loss of accommodation. Many of these processes and triggers are gender specific. Jumped on a bit there, are gender specific, and that they disproportionately impact on women, and most often women on low income specifically. So I'm just going to go through some of the existing evidence that's out there at the moment, and to flag that to understand women's homelessness, an intersectional and nuanced lens is also needed. So in terms of family homelessness really does have its root causes in the dynamics of in the housing market in Ireland, specifically lone parent families being squeezed out of an increasingly competitive and unaffordable private rented sector. And the Focus Ireland data I was involved in collating found that 36% of families became homeless due to a landlord selling or taking the property back for own use. And more recent data from the DRHE in August 2022 found that 50% of families reported the cause of their homelessness was receiving a notice of termination in their rental property. And we know from RTB data that this trend is set to continue as landlords are selling up in larger numbers. And relationship breakdown is another key driver, and also domestic violence, which can also impact on families and housing instability. And Mayock and WIRI last year published an in-depth report on the intersection between domestic violence and family homelessness, which is really worth reading, as it was a previously very unexplored kind of topic. In this vein, it's important to recognize that in this vein, just reflecting on the domestic violence issue, it's also important to recognize that home itself can be a very dangerous place for some women, a place where they might be subjected to violence and abuse. So it's something just to consider when we're also talking about women's homelessness and the role. So for single homeless women, we found in our research myself and Paula was intergenerational poverty, childhood trauma, family instability, relationship breakdown, domestic violence, all featured very heavily in their accounts of homelessness. And many of these traumas are not addressed at an early point and can be and lead to exacerbation of mental health or substance use issues, which in turn can result in a barrier to exiting homelessness into housing. And it's worth noting that single homeless women may also have children from whom they're separated and are living in care of relatives and the state of care in the care of relatives or the state, and their status of as mothers is often overlooked or unacknowledged. Discrimination is a key consideration as well when thinking about a more intersectional approach to women's homelessness. So there is evidence of discrimination in the housing sector in Ireland, notably in the rental sector. When looking at it for a property as well, it may be very difficult to prove that you've experienced discrimination. So just because a property isn't offered to you, it may not be clear cut that it's because you're a traveller or another ethnic minority or a single mother or a disabled woman, or because you're, dependent on HAP. And furthermore, many may face barriers due to socioeconomic class or accent. And even if you did have proof of this, socioeconomic discrimination isn't covered currently under equality legislation. And just following on from this need for an intersectional approach on women's homelessness, I just want to expand a little bit for a moment on the specific barriers migrant women face. So migrant homelessness is increasing both here and across Europe. And again, definition and measurement of this group can be inconsistent and patchy and specific, and including for women. And migrant women in particular have received insufficient research and policy attention here, and even though they would arguably face a double disadvantage. The causes of homelessness include lack of sufficient financial resources, often combined with discrimination, immigration, residency issues, access to social housing, etc. In our research, we published analysis on a subsample of migrant women who, totaling 17 of the original 60 women we interviewed. And domestic violence was a key theme here and a primary cause of their homelessness. But their situation was further complicated by economic disadvantage and residency or immigration status issues, as well as low income and barriers to services and supports. And again, this highlights the need for an intersectional approach to women's homelessness with a view to capturing distinct experiences according to social categories of gender, age, class, citizenship, ethnicity, in the context of shifting housing markets and shifting welfare systems, and also of immigration policies. And I included a quote here from one of the migrant women from our study who had left an abusive partner with her child and had no access to benefits or entitlements, and she was left in a state of limbo, and described how everything for her and her life was really standing still. In preparing as well for this presentation yesterday, I just wanted to include a little piece about stigma and how this might be internalized by women who are experiencing homelessness, because I do think it has relevance to the question of a constitutional right to housing. So when you insert homeless women into a Google search engine, which I did yesterday, this is what comes up. After presenting the homeless figures here today, you can see how this imagery of homeless women is very far from the reality, and that the prevailing dominant imagery and representations of homeless women is street homelessness or the bag lady, or depicting women as either victims or sinners. And these stereotypical images and representations of women are commonplace and can be attributed to the dearth of research on women's homelessness on the one hand, but also prevailing gender norms that situate women in the home on the other hand, especially when considering women's role in the home enshrined in our own constitution. And many women who are homeless are judged by wider society due to their perceived failure for fulfilling the socially accepted gender roles of domestic homemaker, of mother, of daughter. And this impacts on the sense of self. Like in this quote that I'm going to share of Grania, who I interviewed. This was from her second interview. And she describes, "I just want to be treated normal. I just feel in this kind of bubble that I'm caught with all the different services and the HSC, that I can't be myself, I'm getting used to it and I don't know who I am. I'm beginning to think I'm just a number now, and I'm feeling very sorry. I'm losing interest in myself. I don't care, There's that many people referring to me as a number, so I must not deserve it." So as Grania describes, having a home provides us not just with physical shelter, but with a basic sense of self, of privacy, of personal security, of autonomy, and of personal dignity. And also it enables control and autonomy and to develop our own personal identity. And this leads us to my kind of final concluding point of just around the argument for a constitutional right to home. And our starting point to this is the fact that adequate housing is important when we recognize the profound trauma experience when we do not have a home. And there is of course no legal right to housing in Irish law. This right, the only rights that can be legally relied on are the rights around the edges of the issue. So the gap in the law is clear. So according to an IREC poll carried out in 2020, 82% think that housing is a basic human right. So perhaps in the context of a housing crisis and the soaring homelessness issue that we're seeing at the moment, the Irish people do appear to be recognizing that housing is a basic necessity. And I think that we as a society understand that it's how fundamental it is to have a home for our own well-being. And introducing a right to housing in Irish law would not give a right to a key to a home for all, but the right to housing would provide a clear floor or protection with respect of basic adequate housing. And state policies and decisions would have to reasonably protect this right. And the courts would review whether the right is being respected. And a right to housing would allow the courts to have a judicial oversight over whether the basic right is adequately protected. And there appears to be a recognition by all that the state does need to intervene at times when the market fails. And a right to housing puts the obligation that everyone is decently housed, and that, as Marcuse and Keating puts it, the for-profit market is managed and regulated in a way subservient to that goal, so that housing rights can be enjoyed by all. And finally, I just want to end by referencing an interesting doctoral study that Beth Watts published in 2013. And I think it's relevant to the argument for a constitutional right in Ireland with respect to women's homelessness, though her focus was on men. In her study, Watts compared Ireland to Scotland, which, in case you weren't aware, operates a rights-based approach to housing. And her findings were particularly interesting with respect to how homelessness was conceptualized by those designing, delivering, and experiencing homeless services across these two jurisdictions. In Ireland, she found that those experiencing homelessness felt the weight of personal responsibility for their situation more heavily than in the rights-based approach found in Scotland. And they were more likely to lack agency and resign to their very challenging circumstances. Moreover, Watts argues that individually enforceable legal rights to housing offer significant advantages in advancing how service providers and wider society views homelessness, looking beyond homelessness as a personal failure and overriding the normative concepts of deserving and undeservingness. So if the right to housing was to be enshrined in our constitution, then homelessness would be recognised as a failure of the state to implement this right. And this would change the way we as a society think about people who are homeless. And there would be a shift from blaming people for their homelessness to highlighting the state's failure to fulfil its obligation to protect this right. And I would argue that Watt's point is particularly valuable when considering its impact on women's homelessness and the immense shame and stigma internalized by women who find themselves out of home. So yeah, just concluding all it is that I've said, but in sum, I would just say that the constitutional right to a home would recognise that home is central to the dignity of every person and would over time benefit the growing number of women facing housing precarity in this country. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there. If anyone wishes to contact me about any of those references or readings, please do let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this amazing presentation. So you brought a lot of information, very interesting perspectives, and I was particularly impressed by the increase in female homelessness that you noted in the beginning of 219% is extremely high, and it keeps increasing. And it was also interesting to hear about the complexity of female homelessness and how this is influenced by several issues, from poverty to relationship breakdowns and domestic violence. And I think also at the end, you made a very, very relevant point in relation to the impact of having the right to housing in the Constitution and how this could affect the design of policies that would be trying to address women's homelessness. Thank you so much. So now we'll be moving on to our next speaker. So just to let you know, if you have any questions, we will be reading those after the next presentation. So our next speaker is Dr. Ekaterina Yahyaoui. She's senior lecturer in human rights in the Irish Center for Human Rights in the School of Law at the University of Galway. She's currently the Vice Dean for Research in the College of Business, Public Policy and Law. She's an expert in various dimensions of human rights and international law, dealing with exclusions and deficiencies along gender and cultural lines. In 2020, she published a monograph discussing the limitations and possibilities of the concept of gender international human rights law, a book entitled Gender and Human Rights, Expanding Concepts. Ekaterina will have now 10 to 15 minutes to address the audience. Over to you, Ekaterina. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will be trying to share my screen. Yeah. So the way I approached this topic is based in my expertise in human rights law, because one of the things I should say from the beginning, I am not an expert in homelessness. My basic interrogation as it relates to the question of human rights, it's not so much the right per se, but how the human rights interact with gender. And so the way I approached it was also trying to see how rights framework can help us to deal with gendered impacts on homelessness. So that's basically the idea behind and what I will be talking about. And you will see this question of substantive equality will come up as an important element in my response to this interrogation. And I start with talking about this very specific case, a particular case, which I think illustrates many of the dynamics which were presented in the previous presentation. So I think it's very helpful. And also actually it shows how many concerns are shared across borders. So the concerns are in relation to homelessness and gender, which Sarah mentioned for Ireland. They are actually the same in many other countries and many places around the globe. The case or the sort of the story which I present as a beginning is based on a case which was submitted to CEDAW, Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is a body monitoring treaty dedicated to women's rights, which existed at the international level. So the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And in this particular case, it was against Canada. So woman which was affected comes from Canada. And she comes from one of the Aboriginal communities in Canada. And more specifically from this place, which is pictured on this background picture. So living in cities, but then she wanted to return to her community and bring back her children who were all
I think Ekaterina, you were having connection issues. Do you want to try again to share your screen?
Yeah. I just, sorry, I don't know what happened. It just suddenly kicked me out.
That's fine. It happens on Zoom. So I think you can continue.
Yeah. So she was a member in this, again, I'm not sure if it's the precise point where I was kicked out, but hopefully it is. There was a specific program on housing for the members of the community, and she tried to apply for housing there as a member of the community. However, one thing that happened, and her partner was not the member of the community. So first, what happened is that her partner applied for housing. He was obviously refused the housing because he was not the member of the community. But then she was advised that she needs to make a joint application for housing with her partner. And so she wasn't told that she can apply herself. And she did a joint application. They were granted housing. And during this time, her partner also becomes a member of the Housing Authority Board. And so as violence continued, and actually she tried to gain independence, get employment, bring her children back, and so on, her partner, this violence escalated, and her partner, basically what he does is that he removes her name from the co-ownership document, and then he changes the locks, and so she becomes homeless. I won't go into other details of this particular case, because there are some other complications, because she tried to regain her home. She made several suits in courts, but she was not successful in Canada. And this case started actually in '95. And at that time, you know, in Canada, this integration of gender was already quite advanced compared to many other countries. So despite all her attempts and several suits in courts, she wasn't able to regain her home. She was unsuccessful, so she went to this particular treaty monitoring body at the international level to claim back her home. Because one interesting aspect about this case is that she wanted to live in her community in this particular house, which was a three-bedroom house. At some point during the proceedings, she, for example, was proposed a one-bedroom house. She refused it. Also, many lawyers tried to persuade her that she accepts money settlement. She said, that's not what I want. I want my home back. I want to live in my community with my children. And so this case also illustrates a particular aspect of the story of homelessness, because it's a very multidimensional aspect. The way we multidimensional notion, the way we understand homelessness for each person is different. And it can include not simply a roof of our head, but also our ability to integrate into the community, assert our identity, and many other aspects. So basically, because she had a particular view of what for her means to have her home, she wasn't able to assert this right in Canadian courts. Because what was, when the question raises in relation to this particular case, what is wrong in this case, we can have very different views on that question. And for the state, for Canadian state who was responding to the situation, they said, you know, this is a particular personal dispute between her and her partner. And the abuse of authority, whereby she was removed from the deed, was done by her partner, who was on the board, and it was not done by the state. And basically, the state was trying to argue that there was no legislation or policy which she singled out as being discriminatory. So there was no discrimination. There was nothing wrong with this case. It's very unfortunate that she found herself in this situation, but basically the state did nothing wrong. Maybe many people who are on this call will feel that it's unfair, but it's like, you know, if you go very formalistically, point by point, around legal arguments, many people will say, yeah, maybe the state is right. Like, what actually was wrong? Many people will not understand, because this understanding requires the understanding of a gender dimension of this case. And so, fortunately, we have this body at the international level, which does have this understanding of gender and dimension. They confirm that discrimination occurred. So if you remember, I said the case started 1995 for her, and the decision by the committee was in 2012. And then it took also time for her to actually get a proper remedy from the state. So it took her 11 years to claim this right. So it's a very long process. But the question which arises in this regard is, how is it that human rights law is able to deal with this situation differently and to see this very different, perhaps, perspective on this particular case and on the wrong? And my argument is that the most important notion in this regard, which helps us to see the wrong differently, is the notion of substantive equality. Now, I should say that when we talk about substantive equality, sometimes we have many different understandings of that notion, so we might understand it differently. But I'm basing my understanding of substantive equality on the four-dimensional approach, which is proposed by Sandra Friedman, which talks about four dimensions of substantive equality, which should not be taken as a definition of equality, more as a sort of what the term says, approach. What do you do when you face a particular situation? How do you understand that there is actually something wrong that occurred? And so she talks about need to redress the disadvantage, because in this particular case, we clearly see a disadvantage which a woman experiences because of her gender, but also here we have intersectional factors, again, things that were mentioned in the previous presentations, like being victim of domestic violence, being poor, being single mom. These are all factors which play into this situation. And then, of course, stigma, stereotyping, prejudice, all things that she experienced along her way to gain her home back. Then from the perspective of substantive equality, the state has also the obligation to enhance voice and participation. So it's not simply, okay, you lost your home, now we give you back because somebody told us to do it. But it's also trying to make possible for people to voice their concerns, to explain what is that they need, and not simply what the state or the law tells us that people need. And to accommodate difference and achieve structural change. So basically, substantive equality aims at not simply redressing a particular situation for one person, but achieve structural change within institutions, within states, within structures that exist. So that's why I think the substantive equality, if understood correctly, is actually a very useful tool which can help us to see not only gender dimensions of homelessness in this particular situation, but also of other issues, but also see all other intersectional factors. So basically, intersectional approach and addressing systemic discrimination are parts or lenses of substantive equality. And what is important also, by using this lens of substantive equality or the approach of substantive equality, what we see also that instead of blaming people for being homeless or situating them in a stigmatized position as victims, helpless, or whatever, we see that the emphasis changes and is placed on the society. That is, society has to change in order to be able as accommodating of difference as possible. So the individual also is not positioned as simple passive recipient of charity, but empowered in the process. And actually, substantive equality can help us to address homelessness in all its multidimensionality. So not only, okay, getting shelter for people, but actually addressing all these different understandings of what home means for different people. And so the in relation to now addressing homelessness in Ireland through human rights lens, because human rights law, of course, is the principles that I presented you exist at the international level. But what about applying this principle in Ireland and having, for example, a constitutional right to housing? The basic problem which we need to keep in mind is that there exists a disjunction between international human rights law understanding of equality and that same understanding of equality in European and domestic frameworks. They are often very different. When we talk about equality, we very often talk, unfortunately, about very different things which are uncomparable. And so this substantive equality understanding is present in human rights for at the international level, but even if you go at the European level, you will see already that it's slowly fading. And when we go down to domestic level, it becomes even more faded away. I am not saying that there are not some elements of substantive equality in Irish constitutional approach to equality, but they are very, very sort of weak, let's say, compared to the international human rights framework. So very important point, I think, to keep in mind is that introducing constitutional guarantees has to be accompanied by a very strong effort to reinterpret equality in substantive terms, because otherwise we will create series of rights. Of course, these rights will help and empower people. That's something which I think really towards the end of her presentation, Sarah emphasized that it's very important. It helps people. But at the same time, you know, it will be battles which will be won at certain particular periods of time and for certain particular people, but the system will not change. So that's why I think introducing this substantive equality understanding into rights discourse is very important, and this is particularly important in relation to homelessness as a multidimensional, very complex gendered issue where moreover intersectionality plays also a very important role. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Ekaterina. Those points were very relevant. That was very interesting to see that case that you introduced in the beginning and how that particular person was able to challenge those decisions and especially able to highlight the discrimination that she was facing. And I also found very interesting the differences that we're explaining in relation to the understanding of equality in the international level, in the EU and national levels. I couldn't agree more with you. This is what I observe also when I'm analyzing equality in the design of public policy, especially housing policy. Thank you very much. So I think now we can open the floor for questions. I know that we have already a few of them in the chat. So Mairead, can you take over now and read some of the questions?
Yeah, myself and Nadine are going to alternate between the questions. So the first one we have is, do you think the public sector duty can be used to challenge the discrimination experienced under the 9 grounds that Sarah talked about? If not, what route to claim rights?
Sorry, Ekaterina, do you want to go ahead there?
I think, because I think I read this question before I started my presentation, and the one thing that I was thinking is that it depends how you understand equality. And so the point is that in Irish constitutional law, as far as I know it, because again, that's not my area of expertise, let's say, I do know a little bit, but not too much. The understanding of equality is quite formalistic. So I'm not so sure whether using equality framework will necessarily help if equality continues to be understood in formalistic terms. Because when you understand equality formally, you always compare something to a norm, and that's the problem. Because of course we know that gender is not something which is, usually it's out of norm. And so when you compare something to the norm, you tend to not see the problems the way women, for example, do need to see them. But if equality is understood substantively in substantive terms, that's where, of course, that's really the mechanism that will be very efficient, of course, over time, because even for this particular case, it took so much time and so many efforts to get a successful outcome. And when we talk about substantive equality, we are also talking about structural change within societies. And therefore, of course, it takes time, but it will be efficient in a sense in the long term, because we will change the system, not simply help one person or two persons. So that's my reaction to that question.
I suppose just on the public sector duty, I mean, there are, when it comes to housing discrimination, there is, like, you know, legal routes whereby you can challenge, you know, through the RTB or WRC and that around equality issues through under the Equal Status Act. But I think just a point on the public sector duty is it's highly compatible with the rights-based approach, you know, and I think that it's very important to promote but also enforce the public sector duty across all our public sector bodies, and I think that in tandem with a constitutional right to housing could, and particularly around the enforcement question on the duty, could have a positive impact on combating housing discrimination.
So there's been a few questions about slides, if they're going to be made available. So we usually put the recordings up on our YouTube channel, so I'm not sure about the slides.
Of course, I'm happy to share slides. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, usually I share on the YouTube channel as soon as we are finished here. So if people want to check our YouTube channel, it's going to be there between today and tomorrow maximum.
I actually had a question myself there for Sarah. I was just wondering, how do you think that the data collected on women's homelessness could be improved?
Well, I suppose it would be the gaps that I referenced in the presentation are, I suppose, where I'd start with, particularly around, I mean, the domestic violence, I understand, is, you know, operates under a different departmental remit and therefore is not counted within the Department of Housing published figures. However, we don't have any sight of those figures anyway. So regardless of whether they were combined with the Department of Housing figures, it would be good to just get a sense of the, like a timely sense of the scale of the numbers in domestic violence accommodation. And in terms of hidden homelessness, I mean, it is obviously a challenging endeavour to try to capture hidden homelessness. And there's lots of different examples that you could draw on, particularly from Denmark, who have probably one of the few very strong examples of how to capture hidden homelessness. But I think a first port of call is just even to acknowledge the fact that the homeless figures as they currently stand fail to capture the true scale of women in housing precarity, and that if we're only responding or developing policy solutions based on the current figures, then that's, yeah, problematic. But yeah, so I would say there's a range of different ways to go about it, but I mean, the low-hanging fruit would be just to capture the numbers in domestic violence accommodation, the numbers that are dependent on other emergency forms of accommodation, including asylum seekers, refugees and everything. So, and like I understand as well, but again, the data is just not there. I understand that there's a growing problem around, you know, asylum seekers who have been granted refugee status but are absolutely stuck in direct provision accommodation too, or other forms of overcrowding or housing inadequacy. So there's just a lot we don't know right now, and a kind of some, you know, large scale household survey to capture hidden homelessness and those precarious forms of housing marginality would be incredibly insightful and really allow us to understand the degree of housing need.
Do we have more questions, Mairead or Aideen? You are muted.
I have a question for Ekaterina, sorry for mispronouncing your name. How do you think a human rights-based approach can be incorporated into a right to a home in Ireland?
Okay. So first, yeah.
And will the issue of different understandings of inequality here would that affect implementation of such a right?
Okay, so I think yes. So the second part, the answer is yes, because the different understanding of equality will necessarily affect how the right is implemented. Because it always, you always start the procedures in the domestic courts or in domestic fora, and then you try to go up, because you cannot access international fora without exhausting domestic remedies first. And so it will affect, in a sense, that first of all, journey for people who are trying to claim rights will be very long. Now, I think it's very important to continue this conversation, because first of all, maybe if it's, I don't know to what extent it was clear or not, I'm not at all against constitutional right at all. I think it should be there, because it's a first necessary step. But what I'm trying to say, it won't be sufficient if it's not accompanied by correct reinterpretation and understanding of that right. Because it's again understood on the mainstream terms, on male terms, we will still face all these problems, although maybe slowly we will be able to get somewhere, but the problems will continue if the right is not understood from a perspective of women too, let's say. And we know that without the substantive equality framework, very often that's what happens, because the formal equality framework tends to impose the lens from the sort of the dominant perspective, which is usually the male perspective. And so it's very important that this conversation about the right to housing evolves together with all this experience of other states, but also human rights treaty monitoring bodies and other human rights fora, where they already have the experience and how should I say it, understanding of this gender dimensions of homelessness. So that if the conversation starts from the beginning together with human rights perspective, then I think it will be there will be a stronger guarantee that by the time people start claiming that right, that understanding will be there. I'm not sure if that's not clear what I tried to say.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah.
There's a question here, and then a second one that's kind of related to the first one. Would the adoption of the ethos light definition of homelessness in Ireland help? And then the second question is, which agencies would you see adopting ethos light making a difference? And the comment that this issue is with the statutory perspective, and there needs to be a political motivation to do this, which is lacking.
Yeah, I put the second comment in. Hi, I'm Maxine Radcliffe, and I'm looking at this area, and I work in this area in the HSE. Just to say, ethos light's great. I've never even seen a statutory agency have any interest in measuring it that way, and that was more my comment rather than a question.
So just for those who might not be aware of ethos light, ethos is a kind of a European benchmark on a typology of homelessness and housing exclusion, and the core objective of ethos when it was developed was to create a standardized framework of different forms of housing, different forms of homelessness and different forms of housing precariousness, with a view to create a standardized, with a view to be able to compare data systems across Europe. I think it's a really important point, Maxine, just around like ways in which we could kind of push this forward. And ethos light is a slimmed down version of the wider ethos typology. And like, I'm not sure the answer to the question just around how to kind of drive it forward, apart from us talking about it at events like this and that, and thinking about it. I mean, I suppose the obvious choice around how do you compile and present homelessness statistics via Ethos Light would be through the Department of Housing, and for the Department of Housing and local authorities to collate this information. But yeah, like I think even if we have separate entities of statistics that we can compile to understand where Ireland is from a Ethos Light perspective. And Ethos Light includes people sleeping rough, people in emergency accommodation, people in temporary dwellings and structures and that. So even for that would be just very important to be able to compare with other European countries. So yeah, maybe political motivation, maybe it's also a case of you know, the challenges, there are challenges around defining, conceptualizing, measuring homelessness, but I think it's an excellent place to start. So yeah, thank you for your question.
I just wanted to add the comment that I've been pushing this sort of within the DRHE and previously in my previous job with Westminster Council in the UK. And it's just, people say, well, how do we do this if we're not measuring people bedded down in doorways? How do we know? And how do we verify it? And I think the big thing is about moving away from this concept of verification, particularly when there's a recognition of vulnerability. So that's certainly the angle I try and push, but it just, you know, it's deaf ears, to be honest, at the moment.
Yeah, and if I can make a short comment on that, having this kind of data is essential for us to understand the extension of the problem, because, for example, when we look at the 10,000 people who are, actually it's over 10,000 now, it's a record number, who are experiencing homelessness at the moment, we know it's much more than that because of the issue of hidden homelessness. So some calculations put that number on something around 200,000 people. And these would be more realistic considering the complexity of the problems and the different ways that people are affected by that. So having these data is definitely extremely essential. Back, do we want to?
Yeah, I suppose that I initially asked the question about Ethos Light because I work with the traveller community, and we as a region in the Southwest, we did a piece of research around hidden homelessness, and we can see that the impact of families not even being counted on the stats means that we've had families on the housing waiting list for 20 years without any offers of accommodation. And you know, and we're talking about families that are sharing like hugely overcrowded spaces. And so you're thinking it's really important that I think that we do always include ethos in our discussions around housing and homelessness, because I think we're letting the state away too easy with just throwing their hands up and saying we can't do anything, the market is not providing the houses. I mean, I sat on a homelessness forum recently where the local authority just said, well, what can we do? We haven't any houses to give people, without actually recognizing that they are the agency who are responsible. So it's like, so we do need to keep using these models, whatever's available to us, to actually show that other countries are dealing with it. They are recognizing hidden homelessness, and we need to do the same.
Yes, Becky, I fully agree with you. That will be very relevant for us to see this definition expanded, so we would have a better idea of the needs that people facing homelessness they have in Ireland, and especially if it happens that the right to housing is included in the Constitution. It's important also to think how these rights are going to be implemented, because it's going to cover a lot of housing needs. So this is something that definitely we should be paying attention. Just to confirm, Aideen and Mairead, do we have any final questions there? Or people have asked everything?
I think they've all been asked, Valesca,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, that's great. We are just 1 hour within our event, so I think I will start closing. So I want to thank everyone who attended our event today. So thanks in special to our panelists, Sarah and Ekaterina, and also want to thank my colleagues in Women in Research Ireland for helping me to organize this event. So, and also I'd like you to know that we will have our annual AGM sometime at the end of October. We're still defining the date, and please check our social media. It will be very nice to have more people joining our committee. So we will be advertising the date in the next week or so. So thank you very much. Have a look at the YouTube video, and thank you and goodbye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Valesca. Bye, everyone.